China seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia, no doubt. It hopes to dominate and control too many parts of this vibrant and vital region. Through its massive military buildup and growing willingness to use military force to achieve its goals, including gray zone tactics and hybrid warfare, China has demonstrated that it wants to fundamentally alter the region's status quo. We cannot look away, and we cannot ignore it. Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. We're not here to pressure other countries to embrace or adopt policies or ideologies. We're not here to preach to you about climate change or cultural issues. We're not here to impose our will on you. We are all sovereign nations. We should be able to choose the future we want to build. We respect you, your traditions, and your militaries. And we want to work with you where our shared interests align for peace and prosperity.
Why did the US just say a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent? Well, because US intelligence, military exercises, and political signaling all point to serious preparations underway in China. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth warned that China is credibly preparing to use force to change the balance of power in Asia, and that the threat could be imminent. He cited daily training by the People's Liberation Army and large-scale military drills around Taiwan, including an April 2025 exercise with over 130 aircraft and nearly 40 warships simulating a blockade and invasion. US officials have repeatedly referenced an unconfirmed 2027 deadline allegedly set by Xi Jinping for the PLA to be ready to take Taiwan. That date, while never acknowledged by Beijing, is treated as a working assumption in Washington. This shift in tone is strategic. Hegseth used the warning to push Asian allies to increase defense spending, arguing that deterrence only works if everyone contributes. China rejected the claims, calling the US the biggest troublemaker in the region. But for Washington, the pattern of military build-up and exercises is enough to raise the alert and make sure its allies do the same.
The reality is that China is already much larger than the United States. For example, in terms of the economy, in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity, China is already about 130% that of the United States.
Why do you think that when you speak to Western journalists or when Western journalists speak about China, there's just so much general condescension towards China?
If you really look at the US bias and prejudice and bigotry against China, I would say at the core of that bigotry, there is a level of racial discrimination. And they forgot that the Chinese civilization really lasted much longer than the Western civilization by any stretch of the imagination. From my perspective, from the Chinese perspective, we look at very particular episodes in the context of our continuous uninterrupted 5,000 years history. In that time frame, the United States is very important today, but is not always that important in our time horizon. So we need to be very objective. And if the United States wants to bully China and try to lock itself out of the largest market in the world, then we in China need to deal with the situation without the United States. I'm pretty sure China will continue to survive for the coming 5,000 years. When the British engaged China for the Opium War, and please keep in mind, it's an opium war. Britain wanted to sell opium to China. China lost that war. And that started the more or less 100 years of downfall or decline of China. I think the big lesson we learned in China is that China need to be very strong. China need to be on its feet. And I don't think any power in the world today will ever even indulge in the fantasy that they can conquer China or bully China or carve China into pieces. China today is the megatrend of the world. Whether you like China or not, you need to live with China, live in peace with China, and get along with China. Be happy to see China's rise. And if there is any real competition between China and the United States, it will be if the United States wants to impose its values, its political system, its ideology onto China, which China will never.
The reason the Americans and the British and the French can't stop China, this is what China did. This was genius. Capitalism is all about doing what? Paying $1 for it, selling it for $1,000, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Air Jordans cost about $7. We're gonna sell them for $250. That's capitalism. We're gonna make what, 100-fold profit, right? Mm-hmm. So the communist, the Chinaman said, you know what we're gonna do? We're not gonna compete with them. 2/3 of the world lives on less than $1 a day. 2/3 of the world live on less than they can't afford to buy all this. So why we want to make a car to compete with Mercedes? Why we want to make a sneaker to compete with Air Jordan? Most people around the world will never buy that. They can't afford it. You know what we're going to do? We're going to make merchandise that the poor can buy. Mm-hmm. China caters to the poor. The problem with America can't get rid of China. How do you put somebody out of business who's underselling everything you produce? Mm-hmm. You see that? You can't mess with them. Everybody buys from China. The whole Asia buy from China. Africa buy from China. The Caribbean buy from China. Central and South America buy from China. We buy from China. How you going to get rid of them? China has made themselves indispensable to the existence of the world. Cheap clothes, they sell it. Cheap food, they got it. The dollar store stuff. Where most of your dollar store stuff come from? China.
Made in China, yes.
So how the hell are you going to get rid of China when China is taking care of the poor people who represent the majority of the earth?
What do you think China is after? And if I may ask you a question, what power with great power pretensions adopts wolf warrior diplomacy?
When you talk about our world and how the world sees especially what China's goals and strategies are, I want you to bear in mind a very important statistic, which is that 12% of the world's population lives in the West, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And let me make one point very clearly and very boldly at the very beginning. How the 12% views China is not how the 88% views China. And so, for example, when you ask about what is China trying to accomplish, and if you want to if I can share with you what I pick up from my conversations with my fellow Asians, with Africans, with Latin Americans, they see that China is trying to come back once again as a strong civilization, which it once used to be. So what we see, therefore, from Southeast Asia is a return of a civilization that we have seen for centuries go up and down. So this is a natural return. Now, you mentioned things, you use words like wolf warrior diplomacy. And what's interesting is that while the term wolf warrior diplomacy is so frequently used in the Anglo-Saxon media, and as you know, the Anglo-Saxon media, let's be very blunt about this, has a very jaundiced view of China, and the rest of the world discounts what the Anglo-Saxon media says about China. What the rest of the world does is to look at what China does and then deal with it. And at the end of the day, you will notice that countries have a choice. Do they want to trade with China or do they not want to trade with China? And if you look at the deeds, China today does far more trade with the rest of the world than the United States does.
In the future, China will be dominant and America will be irrelevant. That is what we're seeing some experts say now. With even government think tanks saying the United States is simply not prepared for a war with China and it's already losing the Cold War. And many arguing that most of the blame falls on Trump and his administration, who are fundamentally unserious people who are more focused on owning the libs, even if it means destroying the country that they seek to rule, than they are on defeating China. Arguing, the tariffs were bad enough, but on top of that, they're cutting public research funding, gutting universities, and deporting talented researchers who can help America own the next century. They're also getting rid of programs for clean energy technology and semiconductor manufacturing, while also wiping out America's soft power across the globe. The American psyche has somehow become convinced that change is abnormal this past decade, and experts say that this is essentially giving China an advantage. With Noah Smith, for example, comparing the US to the Ming Dynasty and that they were the greatest nation on earth for 200 years, and then they became isolationist, stagnant, and backward-looking. Or while the Europeans were developing new technologies, China got rid of its ships and restricted foreign trade, believing itself to be better than everyone else. A story that may sound familiar to what's happening now. Though in the now, China's trajectory couldn't be more different than ours, right? They lead the US in 37 out of 44 advanced technologies. By 2030, China will account for 45% of the world's manufacturing due to their fully autonomous factories. And, when DeepSeek came out back in January, it was treated like a Sputnik moment, but Sputnik moments have been happening for a while now in fields like electric cars, robots, cancer treatments, supply chains, and clean energy. Right? You have many industry leaders basically screaming, how many CEOs have to come back from China saying They're building the future there before America wakes up. Among other things, China's due to build 10 nuclear power plants this year, making them the premier nuclear power in the world. Meanwhile, you have Congress pushing this budget that experts say will kill our nuclear power industry. And you've got experts on China like Kyle Chan writing, Mr. Trump doesn't even seem to grasp the scale of the threat posed by China. The characterization of China as a factory that makes cheap junk is wildly out of date, with them then going on to say that China's using a Manhattan Project-style focus to achieve their dominance in technology. Right? You have all of this as, China isn't 10 feet tall. They face their own struggles like an aging population, but we can't bank on that because that's happening to us too. Our population is aging just as fast, and actually without immigration, we're projected to age faster than them. And that's because 77% of the US population growth actually comes from immigration and births to immigrant families. And so you've got many saying, it's already hard to compete with a country that outnumbers you 4-1, but we're making it even harder by kicking people off our team. And, all of this is last year there was a bipartisan consensus on how to win, and that was doubling down on investing in research, supporting universities, forging economic ties across the globe, creating a welcoming and attractive environment for the most talented people in the world and for people to invest their money. But Trump has literally, and I mean literally, like definitionally, done the complete opposite of that. The future can still be American, but we are rapidly running out of time to change that.
This first 100 days of the Trump administration will go down in history as the greatest grift in the history of our economy in terms of the amount of money stolen and the size of it over the shortest period. Just some data here. Trump-affiliated entities have made at least $300 million in trading fees. The Trump family's net worth has increased by $3 billion, or $1 billion a month since he took office. Just some timeline. The Trump coin launched on a Friday night under cover of dark with all the news about the inauguration. By 3 a.m. on Sunday, it was valued at more than $70 billion, and there were a small number of investors who made large investments on a Friday. Maybe they got a tip or something. They made tens, if not hundreds of millions. And then over the course of the next couple weeks, about 800,000 smaller investors lost billions. This market manipulation, this what would technically be called insider trading by the SEC, we'll never know because on April 8th, Trump's deputy attorney general ordered the DOJ's crypto fraud investigation arm to disband. Trump posted on Truth Social, "This is a great time to buy Donald Trump media at 9:37 a.m. Between 1 and 1:10 p.m., there was a huge increase in bullish zero-day S&P 500 call options. And then just 8 minutes later, Trump announced a 90-day pause on all of his tariffs, and the market soared almost 10%, one of the biggest one-day gains in history. So someone knew what was going on.
Of course they do. He calls them.
That's called insider trading. The market gained $4 trillion while Trump media closed up 23%, increased his net worth by $415 million. On April 23rd, Trump announced that the top holders of the Trump coin would win an exclusive dinner with him, and the coin surged over 60%. Just 58 wallets made more than $10 million apiece, totaling approximately $1.1 billion in gains. Meanwhile, 800,000 wallets of mostly smaller holders have lost money on their Trump coin. And it gets worse. Now the kids run on it. World Liberty Financial, a crypto firm run by Trump's sons, Eric and Don Jr., and they are entitled to 75% of its revenue. And now it's being leveraged to facilitate pardons for criminals. Justin's son, a crypto billionaire, was under SEC investigation for securities fraud after investing $75 million in World Liberty Financial. Guess what, Kara? The SEC dismissed his case. This is what fucking infuriates me. I'm a realpolitik guy. I don't mind a little bit of corruption as long as it's good for all Americans. I don't mind a little bit of strong arming. But here's the problem, or the tragedy. If Trump brought half the competence, expertise, and elegance to governance as he does to grifting, the country would be in a much better place. We have a mob family running the country. That's the bad news. The worst thing is that Michael Corleone is managing the crime, and Fredo is managing the government. You are so good at stealing. Can you bring some of that elegance, that expertise to the government?
$5 billion. For $5 billion, this could be yours. That was the first of the cards. You know what that card is?
Gold card.
It's the gold card. The Trump card, gold card.
China is a market economy. And it's a vibrant market economy, but it is not a capitalist country. Here's why. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo as billionaires control American policymaking. So in China, you have a vibrant market economy, but capital does not rise above political authority. Capital does not have enshrined rights. In America, capital the interest of capital, and capital itself has risen above the American nation. The political authority cannot check the power of capital. And that's why America is a capitalist country, but China is not.
Which could get it out of poverty. The reason China is ahead is it figured out that form of capitalism. It's not private capitalism, where you might take the example Britain and the United States. It's not the Soviet Union, no private capitalism, all government does everything. And now the Chinese, 50-50, with a super powerful state and Communist Party on top. That's a wrinkle. But that wrinkle has been more productive in a shorter amount of time than any of the others. We're going to let the private go under our control. Meanwhile, keep our control by having half the economy right under our That's how we're going to do it. And at this moment, the year 2025, there is no contest anymore. All the hot technology in the world today comes from the United States or China.
Every day, China impresses me more and more, sentencing corrupt politicians to death for $36 million in bribes. That's what I'm talking about. That's the type of Mephistophelian decisions that need to be made. Because we had this input here in the U.S., probably 75% of our politicians will be headed to Gladiator Fridays this week. He was vice president of a state-owned bank, and he was accepting bribes in exchange for help with loan financing and securing jobs, aka cheating the system. But see, in our capitalist society over here in the US, everybody be cheating the system, but they act like they're not cheating the system so they can seem like they're on top because they deserve to be there, even though they went through a bunch of bullshit like this. And it's like, okay, yeah, Nancy, yeah, we'll catch you on Gladiator Fridays. 100%. It may have took him 3 decades to find out that bro was moving so malfeasant, but it doesn't matter. It wasn't too little too late, like JoJo used to say. It's like, oh yeah, you're gonna die today. Well, he has 2 years, but it doesn't matter. He dying. I'm not trying to glorify violence. I'm just saying we need to be more violent with the millionaires over here. Because when they break the law and do some crazy shit like this and take bribes and fuck over a lot of other people for no reason other than monetary gain, oh yeah, you gotta die, son. Go straight to Gladiator Fridays. Good luck versus the lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, you die. Because I know a lot of other Chinese politicians, once they saw this, and they're like, oh, I'm not taking no more bribes. Yo, you about to die, son. No, we cleaning all this shit up. I can't get caught now.
We need to get rid of these corporations and these law enforcement agencies if we want to stop the socialist agenda.
Exactly. I don't know if socialist is the exact word that I would use. I would call it communist agenda.
Communist agenda.
There really is going to be some redistribution of wealth because they stole our wealth. So there is going to be some.
There should be a redistribution of wealth.
Going to be, yeah.
So in order to get rid of communism, we need to get rid of the big banks.
Yeah.
Get rid of big pharma.
Right.
What else? Big tech landlords that are coming in and buying hundreds of properties. You don't even know.
Like China is doing it, and Bill Gates.
Zillow.
Yeah.
We need to get rid of pharma, big pharma, Pfizer, Moderna.
That's right. You know what?
Amazon, Pfizer, Moderna, Apple. We need to get rid of the big pharma companies, the corporations, the big banks, in order to stop the communist agenda.
You know what? Yeah, these big businesses, Amazon, this is the playbook for communism coming into our country.
We got to get rid of the banks if we want to stop the socialist agenda.
Why do we need money anyways? I mean, honestly, I don't see why we need money. We can trade goods. I have a craft. I have a lot of craft.
We're gonna shut down the country ourselves.
So the workers of this country need to get together, go on a general strike. Workers of the world unite, okay, strike, and stop the communist agenda.
This comment asks, why is communism better than capitalism? It's an excellent question with a very simple answer. The primary driving force of capitalism is competition. You get what you can compete for and earn, nothing more, nothing less, whereas the primary driving force of communism is cooperation. We don't see our fellow human beings as competition that we need to defeat in order that we might succeed. We see our fellow human beings as, fellow human beings who, like us, deserve to live a life of dignity and have their basic needs met. When you compare the values of communism to the values of capitalism, communism is obviously and objectively better.
That's it. I've had it with this dump. We got no food. We got no jobs. Our pets' heads are falling off. Is there?
And if you hear this and then go and bend your back, go and bend your knees, baby, shake it to the max. Will the DJ please turn up the bass to the max? Please just rewind, let me shake it to the max. 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 Please just rewind, let me shake it to the max.
Now, for the Chinese, if you have something that they want, if you have something that they need, well, that makes you important to them. It makes you someone that they want to get along with. It doesn't make you an enemy. It doesn't make you, or it doesn't make them want to invade and colonize you. And understand this isn't necessarily based on any particular morality or moral principles. It's just simple practicality. It's good business. If you wage war on a country, then only some segments of your economy will benefit from that. You know, weapons companies, reconstruction-related industries, and so on. But there are huge segments of your economy which will suffer because of war. To the average Chinese business person, when they see casualty figures from, say, the war in Iraq or wherever else, they see from those casualty figures, well, that's just that many more people who will not be customers that we could have sold to because they're dead. That doesn't make practical sense. That's not good business sense. Forget about the moral right and wrong of it. Just from a practical business perspective, casualties of war don't go shopping. I mean, until recently, the U.S. economy was war-driven. It was the military-industrial complex. That was the driver of the American economy. But manufacturing as a percentage of the U.S. economy has declined considerably since Eisenhower first talked about the military-industrial complex. Things have changed a lot. I think it's reduced from around 32% to less than 10%. And about today, about 90% of American manufacturing is not connected to the U.S. military. That means that other business sectors have greater influence than they used to. Business sectors that may not necessarily benefit from war, but could actually be hurt by war. And as the domestic economic dynamics have changed, as you know, so too have the domestic power dynamics with the rise of private sector power and the globalization of private sector power, to where now the owners and controllers of global financialized capital are no longer tied to American prosperity. In other words, the old American model of domination and subjugation is not as appealing as it used to be, because the OCGFC have more diverse interests around the world. And I think that they, being profit-driven and being practical, are going to be inclining more and more towards the Chinese approach to international affairs, the Muslim approach to international affairs, the BRICS approach to international affairs. And I think that's what's happening. Because yes, there will always be a segment of, say, Larry Fink's portfolio of BlackRock clients who can profiteer in the wake of war. But at this point, I think that there's a far greater proportion of clients in his portfolio who won't benefit from war and who would be harmed, whose interests would be harmed by war. And that means the death of Washington neocons. So the military-industrial complex created a monster, the neocons, the neoconservatives in Washington, whose policy proposals, for any kind of international policy proposals, always involve bombing. So they created this monster, but now that monster is redundant, it's obsolete, it's become a liability. But it's like an old device that cannot support a software upgrade. They can't adapt to the new political and economic landscape. So you still have these dinosaurs like Victoria Nuland calling for war with Iran, for example. But the OCGFC, in my opinion, do not want a war with Iran. The global power dynamics have changed, and the U.S. is being forced now to try to adapt. And it's an entirely new experience for them. And they're adapting badly. Because again, it's just not their nature. They're offended at any constraints on their belligerence. They're indignant at the idea that the whole world should not just offer them tribute and gratefully subordinate themselves to American power. They can't stand it. It doesn't compute in their minds. This is a habit of thinking that predates their actual power, and then having power just made it worse. And I don't think that anyone, most of all the OCGFC, believe that they can ever change. And that's why I think America is gradually being sidelined and being abandoned by the global elite. Because they're incapable of updating their software. They're incapable of updating their mentality. And they're incapable of civilizing. Because having had the ability to impose their will around the world meant that they never had to civilize. And they don't actually possess any internal motivation to do so, and they never did. So ultimately, I think that they're going to be left behind. And it's starting to dawn on them, I think, that they're being left behind. But at the moment, I think they're still in denial. I think they're in denial. I mean, because, look, practically speaking, how exactly are you supposed to ever dial back from dehumanizing whole nations, whole countries, whole populations, and then treat them and expect to be treated by them in any kind of normal way. I mean, again, look at the situation inside the U.S. with African Americans. Until today, the racial situation in that country isn't normal. They still don't know how to deal with each other in any kind of a normal way. And the same applies now for the rest of the world and the U.S. Their relations with the rest of the world is very similar to their relations between the former slave owners and the former slaves. Because you dehumanize people. And how are you supposed to get past that? How are you supposed to get that out of your own mind, and how are they supposed to get it out of their own mind about you? It's very difficult. So now the same dynamic, the same dysfunction is going to potentially permanently plague America's relations with the rest of the planet. I mean, in some ways, you could say that the BRICS countries, are almost performing a kind of an intervention, like with an alcoholic or a drug addict. The U.S. is reaching rock bottom, and BRICS is performing an intervention to force them to see, to face what they really are and how they really are, and forcing them to see the way they're going to have to be if they want to recover any kind of respectable role in the world. But until now, I think the U.S. is in denial. They can't face it. You know, Europe is kind of like that last friend of a drug addict who sticks by them until the end, until finally the addict steals from them and lies to them and betrays them too, and eventually they'll lose even that friend.
If China owns $800 billion of U.S. debt, which they do, then of course the United States, as the borrower, has to pay interest, which means that you and I and everybody else gets to pay taxes every year that go to Washington, where they don't fund our roads or schools or hospitals. It's money that the United States government collects and sends to Beijing to pay interest on the debt. And the Chinese use to develop the Red Army. Do you understand? All of this has to happen beneath the surface. Because if Americans understood what I just said, they would realize that beneath all the reality is the opposite. That's the reality of the economic of capitalism.
Do you accept that Britain still has a role in Hong Kong as a guarantor of that agreement, which was originally signed by both China and the United Kingdom? There would be one state, two systems until the year 2047.
There may be people in London who want to stick to that interpretation. However, if you really read the joint declaration, everything terminates at the time when Britain handed over the sovereignty back to China at midnight, June the 30th, 1997. After 1997, Britain is just like any other country in the world in its relations with Hong Kong or in its relations regarding the one country, two system principle.
Let me get this clear then. The joint declaration is dead, correct?
No, the joint declaration terminated when the British government handed over the sovereignty back to China, midnight, June the 30th, 1997.
This is not how 2 million people on the streets of Hong Kong see it. It's not how the British government sees it. What do you say when the British government says there are going to be serious consequences if Beijing doesn't accept Britain's right to have a say in this?
No, first of all, I think whatever the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom said in terms of bad consequences is purely bluffing. I believe between China and the United Kingdom, for example, the United Kingdom is no position to bluff against China and force China to kowtow to Britain. Those years and that historical period had passed by forever, and United Kingdom can better serve its own interest and serve the fundamental interests of the British people if it deals with China with respect, with dignity, with equality, and with decency.
What language we use about China? Are you a competitor? Are you an ally? Are you a threat? How would you regard your relationship with Britain?
First of all, between China and Britain, from the Chinese perspective, Britain is not a rival, is not a competitor, it is not an enemy, is not an adversary. Britain is just an important country to get along with in peace and in friendship and for mutual benefit. Now, how Britain looks at China, it's up to the British government and people to decide. But I think it would be completely misguided for Britain to view China as an enemy or adversary or a competitor. What do China and Britain compete with? China is the largest manufacturer of automobiles. Competing with Britain? No. China is the largest exporter of EV cars and will lead the whole world in EV production. Is Britain a competitor? No. China will be the biggest and most important producer and R&D in terms of semiconductor in no time. Does that mean that China competes with Britain? No. China will be the leading nation in AI revolution. Is Britain a competitor? No. So I think British government should not overestimate its impact on the global scene and view Britain as a rival of China. China is not. China is a fact. China is a megatrend for Britain to live with and get along with. Let's make peace.
The Chinese understand full well what happens when you're weak in the international system. They call it the century of national humiliation. It lasted from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. As most of you know, I'm sure, China was very weak during that 100-year period. And you know what happened to them when they were very weak? The other great powers in the system, including the United States of America, preyed upon them. They were victimized at every turn. The Chinese understand full well if you want to survive in the international system, you want to be really powerful. Indeed, you want to imitate the United States. You want to dominate Asia the way the Americans dominate the Western Hemisphere. This is what my theory tells you. It's what the Americans did, and it's what the Chinese are doing. They want to dominate Europe. If the Chinese want to get Taiwan back, they want to control the South China Sea, they want to control the East China Sea, they want those rocks back in the East China Sea. There's one simple way to do it. Get the Americans out of East Asia and make sure they are the most powerful state in the system. So that's what they're doing.
They used to have a saying that one doesn't have a Chinaman's chance, but they don't say that anymore. They use that expression back when China was weak. But now since Mao Zedong has been successful in making China a strong country, the Chinese have more chance than anybody else. So this saying has become outdated. Well, just as it took a strong China to give a Chinese person respect wherever that Chinese person is found on this earth, when we get a strong Africa, the person of African origin or African ancestry will be respected any place on this earth, even in America. But he will not be respected in America until Africa is strong, just as the Chinaman wasn't respected abroad until China became strong.
China is the only country in history that developed over the last 40 years, became what it is, with poverty alleviation, with growth and wealth for its population, without invasions and colonial plunder. What China has been able to do would be a very interesting experience for other developing countries, countries of the global south, to benefit from. So on the one hand, we have to project what China has been able to do in a positive energy-wise. The other part is actually to share this experience with the global south. And Macau is a great window for this. In terms of this sharing of China's experience and successes with the global south, we hope to be able to, through our center, contact and be working with the think tanks and the academic institutions of the major countries, or all the countries of the global south, as well as to do country-specific studies, because I think this has been lacking, the exchange between the global south and Chinese academic or think tank institutions to improve their mutual exchange and people-to-people contact. And we hope to be able to do that. The other part that I think is significant is we have to think about what will happen with the increasing technological advances creating all kinds of wealth, and how that is to be able to benefit the whole world rather than just select few, rather than just a few countries. And this is something that my partners and I are very, very keen on evolving and developing.
Back to our regularly scheduled program.
Nearly a quarter of the world's maritime trade goes through the South China Sea, which sits between China and a number of Asian nations, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Taiwan. In addition, experts say it has large reserves of oil and gas. In recent years, it's also been the site of clashes between Chinese Coast Guard ships and Philippine vessels as Beijing tries to exert its claim to virtually the entire sea in defiance of international law. A confrontation this past week on the disputed South China Sea.
Your unsafe maneuvers are in clear violation of your obligations for safe conduct.
A Chinese Coast Guard ship sideswiped a Filipino government fishing vessel and fired its water cannons. Philippine officials said its vessel was on a routine research mission, collecting sand. But 3 small uninhabited sandbars in the area are the reasons for heightened tensions. Both China and the Philippines claim sovereignty over them. What's at stake is less about the sandbars themselves than about the body of water surrounding them, the South China Sea. Since 1952, Beijing has claimed virtually the entire sea, everything inside what's referred to as the 9-dash line. In 2023, China added a 10th dash off Taiwan. The Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam all reject China's claims. That was the backdrop earlier this month for the annual joint U.S.-Philippines military exercises known as Balikatan, Tagalog for shoulder to shoulder. 9,000 U.S. troops joined 5,000 Filipino military personnel for live fire drills.
This type of training is absolutely invaluable to us. To be able to get out here to operate with our treaty ally and to be able to set up a defense like this and integrate all of our systems is just remarkable, and we're really grateful for the opportunity.
Some of the drills could have been sending Beijing a message. For instance, the Philippine province of Zambales along the South China Sea coast was the site of an exercise using a U.S. missile defense system to target drones acting as hostile aircraft. A 1951 mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Philippines commits each nation to defend the other in case of attack. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said the U.S. commitment to the Philippines is ironclad. Andrew Chubb is a fellow at the Asia Society and a senior lecturer at Lancaster University in England. Mr. Chubb, help us put what we just saw in context. That clash we saw between the Chinese Coast Guard ship and the Philippine vessel, that didn't just start this year.
Yeah, that's right, John. Those particular reefs and sandbars that were referred to in the report have been the subject of sporadic incidents over the last 6 or 7 years, but there's been a noticeable uptick in the activities and the confrontations this year. In particular, we saw last month China really going public with a sovereignty assertion, with the unfurling of a flag and sort of high-profile news reports laying claim to this particular sandbar, Sandy Key. And the significance of that is that it lies just a couple of miles from the Philippines' main military outpost in the area, which it's been doing some pretty significant upgrades at over the last few years. It's also very near to China, as one of China's major artificially built island outposts. So it's a sort of scene where there's a likelihood of further confrontations if this trend continues.
And why is the South China Sea so important to China?
Well, I think from China's perspective, the dispute is multi-layered. It started as a dispute about islands, particularly the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, but also Scarborough Shoal, which has been a particular flashpoint between the Philippines and China over the last decade or so, through the 70s through to the 90s. You had the initiation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it's coming into effect in 1994. And that set some very clear rules about, they were actually referred to by the Filipino captain just now in the clip, some very clear rules about what you can and can't do in which waters, with some very specific, numbers put on the kind of distance that you can claim off of a particular type of feature, et cetera, et cetera. And China was there at the inception for that particular convention, which the US has never signed, but which now China is kind of flagrantly struggling against those rules. That was really demonstrated, came to a head in 2016 arbitration that the Philippines brought. And then layered on top of all of that, you've got now the US-China geostrategic competition playing out also in the South China Sea and other maritime littoral areas in East Asia, such as the East China Sea.
A lot of Americans, when they think about this region, they think about China's designs on Taiwan. But could the South China Sea be just as volatile or even more volatile than that?
The short answer is yes, it could. The big difference with the South China Sea and Taiwan is the number of players in the area. So you've got the Philippines, Vietnam, you've also got Malaysia, Brunei makes a claim there, Taiwan occupies the biggest naturally formed island. So you've got many different players operating in the area, and that's before you bring in the sort of extra-regional powers such as the United States. Also, the UK has been there recently, Australia, Japan, South Korea has done some patrols there, and other European navies as well have been talking about, if not actually, stepping up to fill some of the strategic gap.
Andrew Chubb, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
China recently said they will never seek hegemony, expansion, or sphere of influence. Can we believe them? Well, we don't need to take them at their word. We can just look at where they are. These are China's military theaters of command. They're just north, south, east, west, and central. This is all within China. Compare this to America's areas of responsibility, which is the whole damn world. This is just an empire hiding beneath the clunky formulation the United States, our allies, and partners. I simply call it White Empire because that's what it is. This White Empire has over 750 military bases abroad, and is fighting multiple wars and committing genocide constantly. China has just one foreign base, in Djibouti, and has started no wars and kills nobody. China actually removes more ordnance from the field than it leaves. It clears mines and bombs nobody. If we look at arms exports, America alone accounts for 43%, but that's the only export center China doesn't lead in. They account for just 6% of the arms trade and falling. This 6% is interesting, however, because it tells you where China's foreign military interests are. 2/3 of China's arms exports go to one country, Pakistan, free Imran Khan. Why? For the same reason that China has a base in Djibouti, to secure their oil interests. Most of China's oil goes through the Malacca Straits, which can be blockaded. They need the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a backup route to the oil. You can actually draw a straight line out from the Xinjiang province to Pakistan to the sea. Now you can see why America is trying to destabilize the Xinjiang province, and it has nothing to do with protecting Chinese Muslims, which is a Venn diagram of people they hate. As you can see, all of China's military and military interests are concentrated around China for reasons clearly to do with their national security. China is obviously trying to defend itself while White Empire is attacking and offending everybody. Next time we'll discuss where White Empire threatens China around the province of Taiwan and how a potential battle around there would turn out. And as always, if you want to read ahead, please visit worldwideweb.indie.ca. It's a website, not just my username.
Do you believe the Chinese will take over Taiwan?
I believe reunification is inevitable.
In the next 50 years?
I cannot say. Maybe 50, maybe more, maybe less if foolish things happen in Taiwan.
If they make it too, what? What happens to cause the Chinese to use force?
They may not have to use complete force. They can just use pressure and destabilize the economy. If they feel that Taiwan under a new government, a new president, is edging away and determined to make a run for it, they're going to stop it. Because they've had 12 years of Li Tenghui, and in the 12 years, although he agreed to one China, to each his own interpretation, in the 12 years he edged and edged surreptitiously away until he came up with the two-state theory, and then the red flag went up.
Yeah.
You're not going to have that.
It's important for us to understand the history of how this issue come about. And it scares me to hear perhaps simplistic attempts at simplistic explanations that this is a conflict between democracy and autocracy, or trying to draw unhelpful parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine. I think how this issue is going to be resolved, if not managed, will have to be determined by the Chinese people. I would say that whether is it the Chinese people on the PRC side or the people on the other side of the straits on the Taiwan side, just like anybody around the world, the people on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, they want to have the opportunity to continue to improve their lives. They want to have a sense of security, including economic security, and we hope that both sides across the Taiwan Straits will be able to open up the channels of communications to discuss where their shared future lies.
In 1965, Mao said, "Imperialism is afraid of China and of the arrows." Israel and Formosa, which is another word for Taiwan, are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Taiwan for us. Their goal, being the imperialists, is the same. China considers Taiwan a part of China and says in its latest military strategy, reunification is an inevitable trend in the course of national rejuvenation. Quite cynically, America also considers Taiwan a part of China. America does not have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Taiwan is just another side bitch like Ukraine, being strung along with false promises, like NATO's just around the corner if you kill half your menfolk and buy more weapons and give up your natural resources. Just as Ukraine was used to poke the bear in Russia, Taiwan is being used to poke the dragon in China, and both will be thrown away like so much kindling on the bonfire of the vanities. Empire could certainly destroy Taiwan like they have Ukraine, but they cannot defend it, and they openly say this, which we'll discuss next time. Taiwan would be yet another war Empire can profitably lose but cannot possibly win. Let's look at the battle order, which is from the US military, so take with salt and chili. America alone is vastly outnumbered, its equipment is old and rusty, and its supply lines will be stretched across an entire ocean. Even if you include occupied states like Korea and Japan and colonies like Australia, White Empire is still outnumbered and outgunned. All the king's horses and all the king's men can't put this dumpster fire together again. The White Empire loses to men in Toyota Hiluxes. What hope do they have against this industrial superpower like China? It's not just that China has more men and material than Empire, it has better trained men and higher technology, like hypersonics and drone swarms. I argue that China is a superior military to White Empire generally, but it's a moot point. There's certainly a superior military in China, including Taiwan. Next time we'll play some war games along with the Empire to see how a war everyone should avoid could go down.
Why are you obsessed with Taiwan? Why not just leave them be?
Defending China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, any inch of land is not 1 inch too much. Any one single person is not one person too many.
Your defense minister said anyone who dares to pursue independence for Taiwan will be crushed into pieces and face destruction. Sounds like a truly peaceful guy.
That's a real statement. If the separatists really want to push the edge of the envelope with the aid of some big country, for example, which wants to use Taiwan as a proxy, then wait until you see what will happen.
Hi, I'm Indy from Sri Lanka, and today we're going to discuss why China is the best military in the world, the number one reason being they're not trying to be the best military in the world. China is just trying to exist in China. All of China's military theaters of command are within China, north, south, east, west, central. They do have the only base they have is in Djibouti, and the only sort of big arms export partner they have is Pakistan. And that's simply because they're trying to secure their oil routes from the oil here against a blockade of the Malacca Strait. So that's just for the national economic security interests of their people. Beyond that, in all their statements, they say, we do not aspire to be hegemon, we're not going to play the same geopolitical games. And you can see it in their actions as well. They're simply just not deployed to take over the world. America, on the other hand, aspires to fight in any environment at any time all over the world. They want to kill anyone, anywhere, all the time. And they're deployed accordingly. They have over 750 military bases, including whole occupied countries like Germany and Japan and so on. And they're frankly overstretched all over the world. Now, this goes against basic military theory, and it seems like they've gotten away with it for a while, but they also haven't. For basic military theory, let's go to Clausewitz, von Clausewitz, who's a Prussian military theorist. In his vital book On War, he said, "There's no higher and simpler law of strategy than of keeping one's forces concentrated." Come on, dude. So America, even though they have larger forces than everybody else, has been unable to concentrate on any conflict anywhere, which is why they lose every one. So from Korea it's a draw, Vietnam is a loss, Afghanistan is a loss, Iraq is I don't know what. But it's not the size of the forces, it's the fact that they don't concentrate them on any particular point. So even a smaller, less equipped force, given time, can simply wear them out because they have more forces concentrated on the relevant point, which is what Clausewitz said. Clausewitz says, like, you had to have relative superiority at the decisive point, not just global hegemonic superiority. Now, America's forces are extended all over the world, which leads to some wisdom from Sun Tzu, who said, to be prepared everywhere is to be strong nowhere, which describes America, or what I call the white empire, because you throw all these other random, like, suck-ass countries in there, like everybody in Europe, and then occupied Japan and the United Arab Eunuchs and so on. They're all part of one white empire. And that empire is heavily overstretched. It seems powerful, but it's thin like a paper tiger. Whereas China is a real dragon in a real lair. And that's why I say China is the #1 military in the world, Russia's #2, and America's a distant third.
Since you got your degree and you know every fucking thing.
Everything the United States does with Taiwan is playing with conflagration. It's playing not just with fire, it's playing with disaster. And it's very similar to Ukraine. And if the Taiwanese act like the Ukrainians, there will be a devastating war. If the Taiwanese politicians say, America's got our back, we declare independence, there will be a war, no question. So whether the United States provokes the war directly, which I think is less likely, or the United States acts in a way which could cause Taiwanese politicians to be reckless in their own country's first, every war game that has been played and every bit of common sense is that the United States gets defeated in a conventional war thousands of miles from the U.S. coast. It's a crazy idea of the United States that they're going to fight a war with China in China's waters. Okay? This is the first point. Second point is such a war could lead to global annihilation. And that's not hyperbole. That's just also common sense. This is crazy stuff. So I come back to the point that Americans are pretty crazy. They're capable of doing crazy things. It's a militarized society. Trump, I don't know what he knows or wants, but Washington is filled with people talking about war with China. And anyone that talks that way is out of their minds and is really doing profound harm to let's say, the expected future of our planet. And so I hope we never come to that, because it would be certainly a disaster for the United States and most likely a world disaster.
Taiwan is Taiwan. Taiwan is not China. The government in Taiwan came from China many years ago. The government is called KMT.
And this is the government that lost the war in China and they came to Taiwan?
Yeah. So afterwards, Taiwan was ruled by KMT. Other parties started to to make it change. DPP is right now our government's.
If you don't know enough history, at least you can use logic to know the truth. Okay, 75 years ago, 1949, Chinese Civil War. So a group of Chinese retreat to Taiwan 75 years ago. If Taiwan is a separate entity or a country in somebody's mind, then that will be Chinese invading Taiwan. Okay? If Taiwan is a special status thing versus a part of China, there will be a group of Chinese army invade another entity. Because that's what happened in 1949, Civil War, retreat to a corner of China. That's why there's no invading of any entity. Okay? Logic. Anyway, so to know more about Taiwan, first you have to listen. Listen to the people who actually know about Taiwan, who has family in both Fujian and Taiwan, like me. So my grandfather, who was part of the army that's retreating to Taiwan, and at the very last night that he need to take that boat, he decided to stay in Fujian. So part of his family, my family, is in Taiwan, but part of the family is in Fujian. And that is a family story, at least part of it. If you don't know enough about it, you need to listen first, then come up conclusion.
You're learning so many important things, and I'm so proud of you.
I'm sick of this communist propaganda. The government is telling that the Americans are working 2 jobs and they're still homeless. No, that's true. That's true. Is it true that millions are bankrupt because they can't pay for medical bills? Like people lose their life because they can't pay for insulin? Oh, that? No, yeah. That's true, yeah. I owe my government an apology. Bro, take this, okay? Just, this nigga Mao? Yeah, just take this.
Mao is absolutely staggeringly important because he brings the notion of Marxism and Marxist revolutionary anti-capitalist mentality to rural areas who didn't have any kappa. For them, they were just beginning to deal with capitalism, and they already had this enormous push against it, which makes the evolution of places like India and China radically different. Mao is as much responsible for that as anybody, probably more so. So that innovation opened up Marxism to become revolutionary for what is the majority of the working class of this world, which is rural, was rural, still is rural. And Mao breaks all that open and makes that a force in the world. What that achieved is the foundation for the Chinese economic development post-World War II.
So does your country provide universal health care? No. Ours comes from private sectors and most of us have to pay premiums out of pocket. What about you? 95% of our country is covered under basic health care. Interesting. How much do you pay for a week's worth of groceries? Groceries are actually pretty affordable here. Maybe about $40 to $50 in your currency, depending on your dietary habits in the city you live in. What about you? You don't want to know. Anyways, that's a fancy car you got there. I bet that must have cost a fortune. Not really, it's just an EV, and it costs under $10,000. We actually have some pretty affordable options over here. Under $10,000? What about your house? I bet your property taxes must be crazy. Property taxes? What are those? Once we pay off our mortgage, that's it. We own the land, everything. There's no taxes after that. Wow, seriously? If I finish paying off my house, I still owe property taxes every year. If I lose my job, I can end up homeless because I can't pay taxes. That sounds pretty stressful. You see, here, 95% of people own a home, and there's no credit scores or credit checks to stop you from buying a home. It makes home ownership more accessible. At least my country still has freedom of speech. We can say whatever we want without the fear of punishment or censorship. That's what you think. But you're just as censored as we are. Only difference is yours is more subtle. What? That's ridiculous. We can criticize the government, protest, and exercise our opinions freely. But can you really say what you want to say? If you criticize certain groups, platforms ban you. If you leak government information, there's punishment. Your speech might feel freer, but it's controlled in different ways. Interesting point, but at least we have the right to challenge those systems. In your country, the government controls the internet and decides what's acceptable. Hey, it's no secret. We do have stricter government oversight, but in your country, it's disguised. Your media and platforms push certain agendas pretending it's free speech, which leads me to ask you, are you really as free as you think you are?
Are you going to ruin this fucking moment?
I absolutely have to.
China has disrupted the market. China is not a free market economy. We tried. We let them into the World Trade Organization. We sent our businesses over there. We made trade deals. They are a controlled, top-down economy. We will never compete and win against them unless you take back the means of production.
Started from the bottom, now we way up. And I got that baddie bitch, she stays up. Ain't no fucking playing, we ain't got.
China is the only country that has developed this new form of capital, which I call cloud capital, which is the part of capital which, when it accumulates, bestows upon its owner the most power. It's the capital that lives inside your phone, the algorithmic AI-driven capital, which is not new. It's been happening now 10, 15 years. If you think about it, there is no British or European competitor to Google, to Facebook, to Amazon.com, to Uber, to Airbnb, to any of these platforms. None. No British, no German, no French, no Indian competitor to them. China has a bigger and better version of each one of them in China. And not only that, but there is an application called WeChat that belongs to Tencent, which, imagine an application, we don't have it here in Europe. You don't have an app that allows you to watch movies like Netflix, to call a cab like Uber, to send tweets, to do that. And on top of that, to send money, to pay, to make payments for free to anyone in the world. For free, no fee, no banking fee attached. That app doesn't exist in the West. The Chinese have it. So, to the extent that the United States remains hegemonic because they have the monopoly of all payment systems. When you pay anybody, even within Britain, that payment finds its way through to the other person, to the person to whom you are making the payment, through a system totally controlled by the United States. Not by the Bank of England, not by England or the European Union, totally by the United States. This is why...
Explain that, because people don't understand. If you're using Visa or PayPal, people get that.
Well, Visa and PayPal are all American.
But a bank transfer, how's that?
Well, it is possible for a payment to be made within Britain without going through one of the filters that go through Washington. But Washington has the means to press a button and stop you from making a payment from Lloyds Bank to NatWest within London. After the Second World War, Europe and Britain had no payment system. We were, in ashes after the Second World War. The continent of Europe was in genuine ashes, and Britain was bankrupt. So when Bretton Woods rebuilt the financial system through the system of central banks, the Bank of International Settlements and all that, SWIFT, have you seen the acronym SWIFT? All this system is an electronics payment system, a messaging system, which messages one bank, £10, 35 pence is going from here to there. That system is totally controlled by the United States, because it was the United States that created it after Bretton Woods in 1944, and that remains to this day.
It's not just the Americans, that Trump initially and Biden later, worried that big tech in China is rising. It's not just that. That would not worry them so much on its own. It is that Chinese big tech, a company like Alibaba or Tencent, Huawei, is rising in a country where the banking sector does not have autonomous power, unlike Britain with the City of London and America with Wall Street. In China, because of the power of the Chinese Communist Party, the political power, the big tech companies and the banks have fused, they've become one. So you have an app like WeChat, which is Elon Musk's wet dream. What Elon Musk wants to do with Twitter is to replicate WeChat. WeChat, imagine an app that does everything. It shows you photographs, it plays music, it shows movies, it allows you to communicate, it's got something like Facebook on it, and allows you free payments. Free payments. You make payments and the bank does not retain anything either from you or from the vendor. The Americans do not have that. And they do not have that not because they don't have the technology to have that, but because, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America will never allow Google and Apple to get away with it, to take over their business. But if you fuse together big tech with big finance, you have something much more powerful, which is what the Chinese have done, than what the Americans have done, have created.
Thank you. First of all, let's face one important reality in the world. There is a fundamental structural change that is underway that has to do with new technologies and that has to do with climate change. And China is spearheading that structural transformation by actually starting very early. Part of the success for EVs and solar panels is that they started much earlier than a lot of the Western economies did. But the really important point to notice is that this is all part of a global supply chain. Okay? China might be leading the way in EVs and batteries and solar panels, but they are all embedded in a global supply chain, and it's going to involve everybody. There's been some recent research that has shown in the last few decades, China's rise, because of the global supply chain, has also pulled up the economic development of many of the neighboring developing countries. And it's going to be the same with EVs and with the renewables actually involving more advanced economies. So to give you an example, I think this is a very important example to make note of, China is investing heavily in Europe directly, setting up plants and factories on batteries and EV platforms, and whether it's Poland or Spain setting up joint ventures with EV, taking advantage of China's technology now. The table has completely flipped to launch their own EVs and EV platforms. So this is a collaboration. Again, it might be that China is heading the way, and by the way, when we talk about demand and capacity, one of the numbers we look at, 45 million EV vehicles needed by 2040 to keep us on track of the green transition. Trillions of dollars of investment that's needed. China's going to play a very essential role.
About what exactly is the role of the Chinese economy today with the world?
Yes. No, that
sounds like a big subject. We can discuss for 100 years, but today very relevant. Please.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a big subject and it's something that we could talk about for hours. But let me try to distill it in a couple of minutes. The first point is that China is very important to the global economy, not just the global business community, but to the global economy. I mean, if you just look at the 5% growth that we're very confident that we'll achieve this year, that 5% growth will already add more to the global GDP than India, Indonesia, Japan combined. So even a so-called slowed down growth of China is actually incredibly relevant for the global economy. In addition to that, what we did a survey of Fortune 500 business leaders, CEOs, and first of all, of the Fortune 500, 140 are Chinese business leaders. That's an important point. Secondly, more than half of those business leaders said to us that they're bullish on China, and they continue to be bullish on China. So I think this decoupling of the global business community to China, even though the headwinds are tougher, is not something that we expect from a practical perspective. Now, I'll just touch upon a couple of areas where China's dependency, the world's dependency rather, on China is very high. The first is supply chains. I think you touched upon that already. But what I would also say is that China's already more than a third of global gross production. It's still more than a third of global gross production, and it's an order of magnitude higher than what US contributes or what Japan contributes. So China's relevance to global production is important. Now, China plus one strategies have been very much in the media and discussions. The reality is, even if you
China plus one, just for those who do not follow the news every day, is of course it's a supply chain.
Yes,
some people want to have another option besides China. Yeah.
Absolutely. So China plus one is essentially diversification of supply chains to provide alternative manufacturing locations in addition to China for global manufacturers. But when we analyzed at BCG what those supply chains actually look like, and you talked about dependencies in electric vehicles, behind the China plus one, you still see China contribution to many of those value chains. So exports from ASEAN to the US are increasing, but in those exports, there's huge China business value add and China manufacturing value add. Same for exports from Mexico to the US. So China's role in global supply chains remains. And one last thing I will mention is China's role in the global south. The global south as a narrative is getting galvanized. And you see that with the expansion of the BRIC membership. You've had South Africa join the BRICS. You've seen Malaysia and Thailand apply to join the BRICS. The BRICS is going to become a de facto subset of the global south with a louder voice. And nations of the global south are looking to Chinese products, Chinese technology, Chinese partnerships. And that's not just true for ASEAN, but it's also true for Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So there's tremendous potential for the world, if you look at the global south as well, in connecting closely to China and partnering with China. So I feel optimistic despite the headwinds about the potential.
Yeah. Are you saying this only because this summer Davos is being held in China?
No, I would say that all over the world.
Oh, okay,
all right. I would say that in our publications as well.
I just want to put it on the record.
Yes.
Please.
Yes, if I can take this role of the state and perceptions from a slightly different angle, right? Let's look across the world. What are we seeing? We are seeing a return of the state, a very strong bang. How is it inspired? Where is the inspiration coming from? I think it's coming from China's success in these emerging strategic new sectors. Look at the revival of industrial policies. By the way, in the data, it's the rich countries that do much heavier industrial policies, not China, but the richer countries, and China was a kind of copying that route. But there's a return of that. Hundreds of billion dollars, CHIPS and Science Act, a Green Industrial Deal, Green New Deal in Europe, Japan, aiming to revive its semiconductors industry through hundreds of billions of dollars investment in high tech. UK talking about the digital economy and infrastructure and so forth, and return of the state. So if the model is so bad and so wrong, why is everybody copying that model with the role of the state? But here, let me be clear. We cannot narrowly interpret industrial policy, and coming back to your perception issue, as a mere subsidies, as merely financial subsidies. Some subsidy has worked in China, some others have worked less well. But what we do know is that the softer policies in that realm matter equally as much. For instance, like infrastructure. EV demand policy subsidies didn't work effectively until the EV charging stations are put in place. That's actually now a big infrastructure investment, talks in Europe and in the US. Similarly, coordination of supply chain, talent, coming back to the financial system. All of that is really important. But one really fundamental aspect of the state involvement is, does it actually ultimately promote competition? That we have seen repeatedly through the studies is that if industrial policies ultimately encourage competition, then by and large, they could have a very positive impact.
Very interesting discussion. I know, Aparna, you want to participate.
Well, I'm not an expert on government policy in China, but I can speak to it from how business leaders think about this, right? I do think that from a world to China perspective, there are opportunities for Chinese businesses still to be able to find growth all around the world. And I think, yes, government policy has something to do with it. For example, the RCEP, which is the largest FTA in the world, finds ways by which China can work closely with many of the nations, almost all the nations of Asia Pacific. And that opens up opportunities. So this kind of international trade deals can be a great conduit. The other thing that we are seeing is we're seeing more digital framework agreements and digital deals that are coming that are dominantly digital in nature. Not a trade deal with a digital component, but dominantly digital in nature. ASEAN starting that first one, which hopefully gets signed in 2025. There are opportunities also for China to take a lead in the world stage to craft and to participate in those digital partnerships. The third thing I would say is I think Chinese businesses, coming more to my area of expertise, which is working with businesses, Chinese businesses can really find avenues for growth all over the world. One area, for example, is AI. We see that around Asia, all over Asia, our research shows that there's far more acceptance and openness for consumers to adopt AI-based solutions. Now, if you look at the same data in some of the Western markets, particularly Europe, Australia, etc., there is a net negative sentiment towards AI. So really benefiting from the net positive sentiment of the Asian consumers when it comes to AI applications would be another area of opportunity for Chinese businesses. Now, today, Chinese LLM models are not at the same quality as, frankly, the American LLM models, but the gap is closing, and there are opportunities in the future.
I do want to touch on 2 points that all of you almost raised or indicated. One is how the Chinese business community are digesting the realities. And as a result, their newest approach to whether you call it going overseas or going global, and what it might be its impact on both Chinese policymakers and also, of course, China's economic growth. Dr. Jin, go to you on that. Many of those sitting here in the audience, they have their companies operating in so many different parts of the world. It has already become almost the latest norm for companies, whether you call it Chinese companies or companies born in China, you name it. How do you see this latest approach is actually impacting on the mentality of policymakers and also the possible growth potential of this economy?
Well, I certainly think that is the next chapter, right? We're embarking on Chinese companies going global.
Remember 20 years ago, there was another earlier campaign of Chinese company going global, but that was very different.
Very different.
Yes,
Traditional
indeed.
industries, and speaking about that, I find it highly ironic that despite the geopolitical tensions in U.S.-China, I think still 4 out of the 5 of the most downloaded apps in the U.S. today are Chinese apps. So that's one thing to take into account. It's a new model. Chinese traditional industries, manufacturing, all of that was kind of the old playbook, right? But Chinese new innovative business models, the digital economy, by the way, which is 40% of GDP as opposed to only 10% in the US. But even coming, back to India, right? China, the new comparative advantage in this new digital age has changed. It's not just oil, but it's data and it's algorithm, it's compute and all of that. So that is all changing. So I think there are real opportunities here because yes, Chinese business might have, in certain sectors, have some headwinds, geopolitically speaking, in the Western countries. There's still a lot of opportunities because Chinese technologies, the new crop of Chinese technologies are practical. They could be tailor-made, could be implemented very fast. They are cost-effective, and they could really be the cost-effective solution to many of the developing countries' present problems. So the question is how to grasp that opportunities, but of course there's still lots of cultural barriers. But as we're seeing, even against this whole geopolitical backdrop, we're seeing many, many more trade agreements being signed all over the world, a lot more regionalization, a lot more, trying to grasp the opportunities by Middle Eastern GCC countries or Southeast Asian economies. And we're seeing a huge amount of dynamism in, I don't want to call it the global South, but ex-Western advanced economies. So I think Chinese companies have a lot of role to play there.
China is an enormous economic experiment. It should be understood in that light. It should not be held up to standards that don't apply to an enormous historical experiment. Let me explain. A half a century ago, China was, by all counts, among the poorest, most backward countries on this planet, and had been in that position, a position that Xi Jinping refers to often as a period of humiliation, for 2 or 3 centuries, during which large and small colonial powers could simply arrive at a port city along the Pacific coast of China, send in a few cannons, a few troops, and establish an enclave, a portion of a of a city which would be for them and their nationals to set up shop and to exploit whatever opportunities for trade might exist. Over the last half century, this country, they went from the worst poverty imaginable. So here you are, half a century later, and it is the admirable object of almost disbelief, or nobody has believed it. They didn't believe it in the 1950s and 60s when there was talk of communes and of incredible rates of growth. They didn't believe it later on when the government shifted. They didn't believe it more recently when economic growth rates were listed every year between 6 and 9%, and sometimes even more, when the usual relationship between GDP growth in China and that in the United States was a relationship of 3 to 1, 3 times faster in China than in the United States. More recently, when they said they had lifted somewhere between 6 and 800 million people out of global poverty into middle income level, people didn't believe that either. People didn't believe any of it. The peculiar quality of China, that instead of allowing slums to develop, they build the housing ahead of the people's ability to afford to buy it, meaning that there are blocks of empty, completed or nearly completed apartments, as if this were some sign of massive resource investment that had gone astray, rather than a strategy, which, by the way, may be the wrong strategy, but it's a strategy, but they're quite different from those in the United States. And the way to begin to understand the difference is to go back to look at it, the big picture. The United States is an empire going down. China is an empire going up. And the ride up is way better than the ride down, as Americans are discovering